The 2024-25 Champions League group stage draw is this week, and whilst most people are probably aware that this season will see a significant format change, I don't think that many people realise quite how radical it is. That's probably because this season's revamp has been a long time coming. The Swiss model, as UEFA describes it, was first proposed before current UEFA president Alexander Ceferin even entered office in 2016. Its implementation was confirmed about 3 years ago, and since then, the final format itself has been tweaked in a number of different ways. The fundamentals, that most of you will probably be aware of, are that the Champions League is being expanded from 32 to 36 teams, the old system of 8 groups of 4 is being replaced by one massive group of 36, and rather than playing 3 different teams twice, at home and away, during the group stage, teams will now play 8 different teams, 4 of them at home, and 4 of them away. In other words then, more teams, more matches, and more complicated. It follows a similar pattern that we have seen throughout the world of football in recent years. The Euros moved from 16 teams to 24 in 2016, having only risen from 8 to 16 in 1996, meaning that there are 51 matches at the Euros now, compared to just 15 in 1992 or 31 in 2012. The World Cup was expanded from 16 teams to 24 in 1982, rising to 32 in 1998, and an enormous 48 from 2026 onwards, increasing the overall number of matches from 64 at the 2022 World Cup to 104 at the 2026 World Cup, so almost a third of an entire Premier League season crammed into the space of less than 5 weeks. And UEFA themselves added the UEFA Conference League to their collection of competitions in the 2021-22 season, adding 36 teams, or 184 including qualifying, and 141 tournament proper matches to the UEFA schedule. The reason for all of these changes, principally at least, is financial. I know, it is hard to believe. Who'd have thought football's governing bodies would be so financially self-interested? I'm shocked, you're shocked. I'm not sure either of us will ever be able to see the beautiful game quite the same again. Just because the motive behind a format change is solely, or at least primarily financial though, doesn't mean that the consequences or outcome of that format change is going to be solely or even primarily financial. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to Switzerland, the home of UEFA and the birthplace of the Swiss model, as we take a closer look at the UEFA Champions League, Europa League, and Conference League's radical new formats, the good, the bad, and the ugly aspects of them, and what could be some of the unintended consequences. The new Champions League format comes at a pivotal moment for UEFA, who currently face intense pressure from a couple of different directions. One is an attack from within of sorts, in the form of the European Super League proposals, which are still very much alive and kicking, and retain some very powerful and influential supporters, including, somewhat inconveniently, the presidents of by far the most successful and dominant team in the history of the UEFA Champions League. And the other is an external attack from UEFA's greatest rivals, FIFA, who are launching a massive new 32-team FIFA Club World Cup from 2025 onwards, designed to challenge the Champions League and become the biggest trophy in the club game. Football fans in England could be forgiven for thinking that the European Super League was dead and buried, or even just a bad dream during our COVID lamentations, but behind the scenes, advocates for a breakaway European competition have been busy sharpening their knives. The European Super League's creation was announced in April 2021 with 12 founding members, the rich 6 in England and the big 3 from both Italy and Spain. Bayern Munich, Borussia Dortmund and PSG were all offered membership but rejected. Within just 50 hours, however, all 6 English clubs had officially withdrawn in response to significant backlash in the media and from supporters, followed by Atletico Madrid, Inter Milan and AC Milan, and finally, in June 2024, Juventus, leaving only Real Madrid and Barcelona still standing. Real Madrid and Barcelona are huge football clubs, arguably the 2 biggest in the entire world, but regardless of their stature, that isn't a league, it's a match. A big match, no doubt, but still just a match. Following the unmitigated disaster that was the European Super League's launch though, which left the likes of Florentino Perez, Andrea Agnelli, and Joel Glazer licking their wounds and with egg on their face, Perez in particular, and later Barcelona president Joan Laporta, went back to the drawing board to analyse what they'd got wrong. The answer, effectively, was absolutely everything. It may be an uncomfortable truth that, toxic as the European Super League proposals were, and still remain, with better marketing, they would never have received unanimous support, but they certainly could have avoided unanimous condemnation and made a far stronger pitch for their cause. Most people dislike UEFA. They are seen as being greedy, corrupt, and incredibly self-interested. The European Super League's fatal flaw was in somehow appearing even greedier, even more corrupt, and spectacularly more self-interested than UEFA themselves. In October 2022, therefore, a company called A22 Sports Management was formed to put a friendlier face, more professional media communications, and a more palatable format behind the European Super League. A22 Sports Management have fought UEFA in the courts, with the Court of Justice of the European Union ruling that clubs have the right to freely discuss and propose new European competition formats, a symbolic win for A22 more than anything else, whilst lobbying the directors of clubs, leagues and associations, building an online presence advocating for their proposals, and redrafting the initially very unpopular format for the European Super League. A22 now propose having a first, second and third league, which would replace the Champions League, Europa League and Conference League, but would be named Star Gold and Blue, seemingly as a reflection of the EU flag, although I think that it just sounds like it was named by a 5-year-old, which they claim, unlike the initial European Super League proposals, would be true to the principles of sporting merit. There would be 64 teams between the three leagues, made up of 16 teams split up into 2 groups of 8 in Star and Gold, and 4 groups of 8 in Blue. Each team would play the other 7 teams in their group at home and away, so there would be 14 group games in total, with the top 4 in each of the Star and Gold leagues, and the top 2 in each of the Blue leagues, going through to their respective 2-legged quarterfinals, at which point the format would resemble the existing UEFA one. The sporting competition and merit A22 claim the new European Super League would maintain is because teams could get promoted and relegated between the Star, Gold and Blue leagues, with 2 teams going down from Star and Gold, and 2 teams going up from Gold and Blue each season. Meanwhile, the bottom 20 out of the 32 teams in Blue would drop out of the European Super League entirely each season, and make way for a new 20 teams based upon their domestic performance. Of course, this wouldn't actually maintain sporting merit, because it means that Real Madrid, for example, could theoretically be relegated from La Liga but retain their place in the Star League, so long as they didn't finish bottom of their group, and even then, they would only drop down into the Gold League, rather than failing to qualify for Europe at all, and likewise, a club like Stuttgart or Newcastle United could win the Bundesliga or the Premier League title, and they wouldn't even qualify for Europe's premier competition the following season, instead only earning qualification to the 3rd-ranked Blue League. Most people probably aren't aware of any of this, the wounds are a bit fresh for A22 and the Super League to fully relaunch yet, but make no mistake, UEFA are acutely aware of the risk that they pose, and the fact that they are waiting to strike. The FIFA Club World Cup, meanwhile, is moving from a 7 to a 32-team tournament in 2025, with FIFA throwing huge resources and a massive PR campaign behind the competition. FIFA has basically long been irritated that it has one major cash cow, the FIFA World Cup, which is the most lucrative competition in world football, but only occurs once every 4 years. UEFA, by contrast, brings in much more consistent revenue by virtue of the UEFA Champions League being an annual competition, as well as having the significant windfall of the Euros once every 4 years. There are many more complicated explanations that one could come up with, but the revamped FIFA Club World Cup is basically an attempt by FIFA to create, if not supersede, the Champions League, by replicating the success of the FIFA World Cup within the club game, and therefore adding another massive cash cow to their schedule. The FIFA Club World Cup will follow the pre-2026 FIFA World Cup format, with 32 teams, 8 groups of 4, the top 2 in each group progressing to the round of 16, and then single-leg knockout ties all the way through to the final. The FIFA Club World Cup, like the FIFA World Cup, will have a single host nation, or nations if it is a cross-nation tournament, rather than any home or away games, which will be the United States in 2025, in preparation for being the primary host of the upcoming 2026 World Cup, and Australia, possibly partnering with New Zealand, and Spain, Portugal and Morocco, ahead of the 2030 World Cup, have already bid to host in 2029. So UEFA are facing threats in multiple directions and are under immense pressure to satisfy all of the various pressure groups exerting force upon them right now, as well as trying to keep fans, broadcasters, and clubs on their side. One thing I didn't mention is that A22 have also proposed that, initially at least, all European Super League games will be broadcast free-to-air on their own in-house streaming service. This is obviously a pretty cynical attempt to garner public support for their proposals, and would likely be followed by the implementation of a paywall once the service had a large database of subscribers, but it is an attack line that UEFA have opened themselves up to by going almost entirely behind a paid subscription, and had that been part of the European Super League's proposals back in April 2021, it would have been interesting to see what kind of difference that made in terms of public perception. One of the creeping criticisms that UEFA have been very wary of in recent years is that the Champions League group stage has become stale and predictable. Because of the seeding of teams in pots 1 through to 4, combined with the increased inequities within European football, with some notable exceptions, the Champions League group stage has become a bit of a non-event. In most of the groups, most football fans could take a pretty good guess at which 2 teams will progress to the knockout stage each season, and very often progress with predictable and tedious ease. Last season, for example, the likes of Bayern Munich, Real Madrid and Manchester City all went unbeaten in the group stage. Madrid and Man City won all 6 of their games, meaning that they had basically or had actually won their groups with a couple of games still to spare. At the opposite end of the spectrum, Sevilla, Union Berlin, Red Star Belgrade and Royal Antwerp won between 1 and 3 points in total across 6 games, with their group stage campaigns effectively having been ended before they'd even begun. There are exceptions, like Manchester United finishing bottom of Group A last season, below FC Copenhagen and Galatasaray, but they are becoming few and far between. Of course, the best fix for this problem would be to make football more equitable. That might sound utopian, but it isn't really, or at least not unless you consider the 1980s and 90s to have been utopia, when Aston Villa, Hamburg, Steaua Bucharest, Porto, PSV, Red Star Belgrade and Ajax were all able to win the European Cup or the Champions League, alongside the more familiar names of Real Madrid, Liverpool and AC Milan. Not since Porto in 2004, 20 years ago, has a team not just outside of the Big 5 leagues, and in fact, the Big 4, since there have been no French winners during that time, but there hasn't even been a team from outside of the established elite in each of those 4 leagues that has won it, or has even come remotely close. By and large, it is the same few teams that reach the latter stages, season upon season, unlike back in 1990-91, we're hardly going back to the pre-war era here, are we? When the 4 semi-finalists were Bayern Munich, Red Star Belgrade, Spartak Moscow and Marseille, and it was Red Star and Marseille who made the final. Returning to a place where those kinds of teams could compete with the new elite would be far too much hard work though. Besides, the real movers and shakers, who control the levers of power and have put the freight of their life up UEFA, want the precise opposite, namely, entrenched dominance, hegemony, and economic guarantees. So forget about football becoming fairer or more fun, that's just a pipe dream among the type of weirdos who watch Alfie Potts Harmer videos on YouTube. Instead, UEFA's idea to make the Champions League group stage more interesting is by having the big, or super teams, if you want to use that word, play each other more often, combating one of the biggest unique selling points, as some people saw it, of the European Super League, even if the true super teams should still find it relatively easy to progress, and by adding some jeopardy by virtue of only 8 teams automatically progressing from the group stage out of 36, as opposed to 16 out of 32, as was the case prior to this season, although, by the same token, only 12 teams will be automatically eliminated, as opposed to 16 under the previous system. In case any of you don't know, the new Champions League format sees all 36 teams drawn in the same group, but still seeded in pots 1 through to 4. Each team will be randomly assigned matches against 2 teams from each of the 4 pots, 1 at home and 1 away, meaning every team will play 8 group games in total, against 8 different teams, which will determine their final standing out of the 36 clubs. The top 8 teams will automatically advance to the round of 16, those ranked between 9th and 24th will compete in a 2-legged playoff round, playing at home and away to determine the next 8 teams in the round of 16, with the bottom 8 teams, along with the 8 teams eliminated via the playoffs, knocked out of Europe entirely. Unlike under the previous format, no teams eliminated from the Champions League will drop down into the Europa League, and the same goes for the Europa League down to the Conference League, which, personally, I quite like, as it always felt like a means of rewarding failure, and handing the typically bigger and richer clubs a second chance in a competition they're probably actually more likely, and certainly better equipped to win. Personally, I'm also a fan of the implementation of a playoff system. They have basically been a success wherever they have been introduced, and UEFA loves the idea because it's like adding an extra knockout stage, which always attracts more interest than the group stage. Having a playoff system also keeps more teams in the mix for longer, both at the top, chasing automatic qualification through the top 8, and at the bottom, looking to avoid that bottom 8 and qualify for the playoffs, thus keeping more teams and fans engaged, whilst also incentivising the top teams to play to their max and fill their strongest or stronger teams in more games, because securing a top 8 spot means playing 2 fewer matches, something that they'll all be desperate to do, as well as guaranteeing automatic qualification, of course. The Champions League knockout stages, which UEFA still perceives as being a success, will remain unchanged from the round of 16 through to the final. One of the biggest criticisms of the new format, inevitably, will be the increased number of games. The increase from 6 to 8 group games means every team will play at least 2 additional games in the Champions League group stage. Meanwhile, half of all teams, as well as half of those who progress, will play a further 2 matches in the playoffs, meaning that they will play 4 more Champions League group games than they did under the previous format overall. There will be people who scoff at 4 extra games, which might instinctively feel like a small number, and in some ways it is, but in the context of an extremely strained calendar, where the top teams already routinely play 2 games a week, have vanishingly short summer breaks, and ever-expanding international tournaments, believe me, 4 extra games will feel like a lot, and it comes at a time when players have already become more vocal than ever about their welfare, the risk of injuries, and their inability to produce their best performances, and therefore the most entertaining matches, as a result of mental and physical fatigue. Another criticism that could be levelled at the new Champions League format, aside from the obvious ones, is that the playoffs are so big, half of all teams, from 9th all the way down to 24th, and there is little reward in actual fact for finishing 9th versus 24th, despite the fact that there is likely to be a fairly sizable gap in terms of results, and points amassed between the two. It seems to me that both of these problems, too many games and not enough reward for finishing high within the playoffs, could be fixed by making the playoff a 1-leg tie, thus halving the number of playoff games, played at the ground of the teams that finish 9th through to 16th, with the teams that finish 17th to 24th having to travel, thus providing a greater incentive and reward for teams to finish higher in the playoffs. Of course, that would mean 8 fewer games in the Champions League as a whole though, and UEFA, probably rightly, anticipates that the playoffs will be very attractive and therefore lucrative fixtures, which, pretty much ruled out that idea as far as they're concerned. Cash is king, baby. Not my words, ladies and gentlemen, but the words of Alexander Cheferin. Probably. The way in which teams are assigned to each of the 4 pots also creates the risk of teams being given much easier or tougher draws, despite competing in the exact same 36-team group. RB Leipzig, for example, who finished 4th in the Bundesliga last season, are in pot 1 in this season's Champions League. Meanwhile, Bayer Leverkusen, who won the Bundesliga title last season and went unbeaten across all domestic competitions, finishing 25 points above RB Leipzig, are in pot 2. Belgian champions Club Brugge, who finished 1 point above Royal Union Saint-Gilloise in last season's Belgian Pro League Champions playoffs, are in pot 2, whereas Stuttgart, who finished as Bundesliga runners-up, and Aston Villa, who finished 4th in the Premier League, are both in pot 4. This has always been the case, resulting in some uneven group stages in the past, but it is likely to have a much bigger impact for some teams under the new format. I'll give you a quick example. It is possible that one team could be drawn against Manchester City, Real Madrid, Bayer Leverkusen, Arsenal, Feyenoord, Sporting Club de Portugal, Stuttgart and Monaco as their 8 Champions League group stage opponents, whereas another team could be paired up with Borussia Dortmund, RB Leipzig, Club Brugge, Shakhtar Donetsk, Young Boys, Slovan Bratislava, Sturm Graz, and either Malmo or Sparta Prague. By virtue of UEFA's pot system, those 2 are meant to be equally difficult draws. As is obvious to anyone who watches football, they are not remotely equally difficult draws. It's not impossible to imagine that a team like, let's say AC Milan, Barcelona, or a handful of others, could be knocked out in the group stage automatically with that first run of fixtures, whereas you'd probably back them to qualify automatically with the second set. Of course, I am using a very extreme example. Most teams' fixtures will fall somewhere between the 2, but I can absolutely cast iron guarantee you, even more than usual, that there will be complaints from fans on Thursday about some teams getting much tougher or easier draws than others. I'd be surprised if there weren't at least 7 change.org petitions created within 20 minutes of it, calling for an official investigation into alleged corruption. The draw itself is also radically different. Because there are so many teams all in one group, and so many different permutations, further complicated by rules like having to play 1 game at home and 1 away from each pot, not being able to face a team from your own association in the group stage, which UEFA initially suggested they were going to scrap under the new format but haven't, and a rule prohibiting teams from facing more than 2 opponents from the same association during the group stage. When they looked into it, UEFA realised that a traditional group stage draw under the new format would require over 900 different balls and would take between 3 to 5 hours from start to finish. These things already drag on, and if UEFA are worried about alienating fans through boredom and losing ground to rival or breakaway competitions, a 5-hour group stage draw probably wouldn't have been ideal. As a result, only the teams themselves, starting with those in pot 1, will be drawn by hand, with their opponents and the venue for those games drawn by UEFA's custom-built supercomputer, or software, in order to speed up the process. If anything goes wrong, they've also built a backup software. If that one also fails, apparently they're just going to scrap it, declare Hull City as the champions of Europe, and tell A22 Sports Management that they can take things from here. The fact that most of the draw is done by software, rather than by hand, I'm confident won't fan the flames of conspiracy theorists and accusations of corruptions and draw rigging even more. Nah, certainly not. I'm absolutely sure of it. It should be said, while we are focusing on the Champions League here, the format is exactly the same for the Europa League. Meanwhile, Conference League teams will only play 6 group games, rather than 8, with 6 pots rather than 4, being drawn against one team from each of the 6 pots, with 3 games at home and 3 away. Whatever your views of the new UEFA format, it is good of them not to overcomplicate things. Isn't it? Here's why the new Champions League, Europa League and Conference League format is a sort of mishmashed compromise which just about appeases everyone. For UEFA, it's not just more games and more revenue, although that is the primary motive. It means that every matchday there will be at least one game between 2 supposed super teams, which they believe can breathe new life into the Champions League group stage and lead to a surge in interest and viewership. For the super teams themselves, more games in football, and in sport as a whole, theoretically ought to lead to fewer upsets, with there being more opportunities for a regression towards the mean. Whereas last season, defeat for Manchester United in each of their first 2 games immediately put them on the back foot, under the new format, not only would they have 2 extra games to try and put things right, they would also only have to avoid finishing in the bottom 12 of a 36-team league to avoid automatic elimination. For the smaller clubs, in a Champions League context, they get more opportunities against teams of a similar caliber to themselves, rather than being drawn against 2 or sometimes even 3 vastly superior teams, as under the old format, making it practically impossible for them to progress or even win a game. You may recall this photograph of the Slavia Prague delegates reacting to being drawn against Barcelona, Borussia Dortmund and Inter Milan in the group stage in 2019-20. You knew it, they knew it, everyone knew it. In that moment, right there, Slavia had just been eliminated. Sure enough, they won none of their 6 group games and finished bottom of their group. The new format gives smaller clubs a better shot at progression, particularly through the playoffs, and more opportunities to win and draw games, while still providing them with those famous nights under the lights against European giants. It's often forgotten among fans of the supposed super clubs, particularly those in the Premier League, how important UEFA revenue, even in the group stage, is to an awful lot of clubs. Whereas Premier League teams have a tendency historically to view the Europa League, for example, as little more than a hindrance due to the massive financial incentives in the Premier League compared to Europe's secondary and now tertiary competitions, for a club like Slavia Prague, a good run in Europe could comfortably double or even treble their annual revenue. What's more, whereas Premier League clubs have to contend with a 38-game league season and 2 domestic cup competitions alongside their European commitments, a team like Slavia Prague only play 30 league games, 8 fewer, and only compete in 1 domestic cup competition. So everyone's priorities and self-interests are slightly different, and UEFA is trying to juggle them all. There has also been an attempt to draw a clear dividing line between the supposed fairness and integrity of the Champions League and the more elitist European Super League. Whereas UEFA's initial proposals for the new Champions League format, which I covered in depth on this channel a little over 2 years ago, saw 2 of the 4 new teams, with the increase from 32 to 36 teams overall, drawn from a long-term coefficient ranking, meaning that if any European giants were to have a bad season, their Champions League status could be protected. Think Chelsea over the last couple of seasons. After that prompted criticism from a lot of people for being reminiscent of the European Super League proposals and a dangerous precedent, UEFA have slightly revised it. 2 of the 4 extra spots are now assigned to the 2 leagues, or associations, with the highest coefficient rank when their number of points the previous season is divided by their number of participating clubs. What that means, in practice, is that the Premier League, Bundesliga, La Liga and Serie A are likely to be battling it out for those 2 extra spots each season, which will go to the next highest ranked team in the league who wouldn't ordinarily qualify for the Champions League, so typically the team that finishes in 5th. It acts as a safeguarding for the biggest clubs, who, invariably, play in the biggest leagues, which are likely to have the best coefficient rankings and get those 2 extra spots, whilst also giving UEFA some plausible deniability when it comes to accusations of elitism, and a legitimate defence against accusations that they are no better than the Super League proposals, which, by any metric, rely far less on sporting merit than even a deeply flawed Champions League format. So can this new format save the Champions League? As far as some people are concerned, they might ask what there is to save. UEFA might be broadly disliked, but the Champions League, as both a brand and an institution, remains extremely strong, in a way that the European Super League or FIFA Club World Cup will find it difficult to rival. Nonetheless, those threats are real, and UEFA can scarcely afford a major misstep if, for whatever reason, the new format proves to be a flop. Personally, I think it is extremely flawed in terms of increasing the number of games in an already jam-packed schedule, the likelihood of wildly different fixture schedules in terms of difficulty, little reward for finishing 9th as opposed to 24th within a 36-team group, and the excessive allocation of slots to already massively overrepresented leagues, but still, probably, in a lot of ways, better than the old system. Make no mistake, it is papering over the cracks of an almost fatally wounded football landscape when it comes to deep-rooted unfairness, and financial disparities that have made it impossible for all but a handful of clubs to compete. But a plaster is better than a kick in the knackers, I suppose. In this context, just so that we're all clear, the new Champions League format is a plaster, and the European Super League would be a swift kick in the goalies. On that bright note, that is it for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Hit the like button if that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. And of course, it goes without saying at this stage, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on not just for this channel, HITC Sevens, but also my second channel, Alfie Potsama, where there are already 3 videos and soon to be a 4th, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might fancy watching after this one. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, or Threads via the username at HITC Sevens on all 3, should you wish to do so, and all of those links plus a whole lot more should be down in the video description below. Cheers!